There's two kinds of anglers, those who know good river etiquette and those who don't. And trust me, you do not want to be that second type of angler. On today's show, I'm going to teach you 3 tips specifically for river etiquette on crowded fisheries. Plus, you're going to get 2 extra tips on how to catch more fish from those crowded rivers. This is Untangled, Fly Fishing for Everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. I hope wherever you are that you've managed to survive this deep freeze that gripped most of the nation. It got to 30 below here in my little corner of Wyoming, so my neck and shoulders are sore from being hunched over my vise tying so many flies lately. It is definitely turned into fly tying season instead of fly fishing season. I don't care who you are. I don't know if you can fly fish in 30 below, and if you can, let me know. Drop me a line or something here on the show. I would love to hear a story from somebody who's fishing in 30 below. But we're not going to talk about fishing in 30 below today. We are going to talk about river etiquette on crowded fisheries, in addition to our other topics, which are some tips on how to fish streamers in murky water, using tippet rings, over and underlining fly rods, a little bit more information about buying waders and knots for tying on flies. So we've got all that coming up. And then episode 62 is coming up in like 3 weeks, if I can do my math there correctly. That is going to be an episode with me and Alex. We're going to sit down and have a whole bunch of information for those of you looking to start tying your own flies. It's going to be a beginner's guide to fly tying. Alex is going to be with me. We're going to try and knock that thing out of the park and jam pack it full of good fly tying info. So you definitely don't want to miss episode 62. That is coming up. But enough of the housekeeping stuff. Let's just dive right into the main part of the show this week, which is river etiquette. Now, we talked about river etiquette on Untangled before. This is all the way back in episode 24. That was more general river etiquette. I'll link that show in the podcast description for y'all in case you're interested, if you're really new and you want to make sure you're not breaking the unwritten rules, because unfortunately fly fishing has a ton of unwritten rules. And so, granted, I'm not really writing them down here on the show, am I? I'm speaking them into existence, but they're recorded somewhere. Now at this point, you go take a look at that old episode and hopefully brush yourself up there. But I want to talk today about river etiquette, specifically on crowded rivers, because it's going to be different when you go to one of these famous tailwaters. That river etiquette there is going to be a lot different than your local stream up in the mountains or your local bass pond or whatever it is, because with so many people and a lot of these places being almost bucket list destinations for a ton of anglers, it really gets, a lot of the rules kind of get rewritten, I think is probably the best way to put it. But we won't focus only on that stuff. I'm also going to give you guys some tips on how to successfully fish these crowded rivers. So, first thing I think to realize with this, though, is that the rivers are crowded these days, and they are probably going to stay that way. And while river etiquette rules are generally the same, it is important, like I mentioned, to understand what changes when you're on one of those heavily pressured tailwaters, like, not just a tailwater, any of the heavily pressured rivers. I'm thinking the Madison, the Yellowstone, the Green, the Missouri, the Bighorn, the North Platte, the South Platte, the Frying Pan, the Arkansas. Those all jump to mind immediately when I think of crowded fisheries. But you've also probably seen the crowding increase, unfortunately, on your local creeks and streams as well. So I think these tips could apply to those instances as well. So again, I got 3 tips for you for river etiquette and then 2 tips on how to catch more fish when you're on these really crowded pieces of water. All right, tip number 1. Even though it's crowded, don't crowd each other. Now, this comes with a huge caveat because of local customs. Local fishing customs might dictate that people feel just fine fishing way closer to you than you might particularly like. I can immediately think of all the times on the river that runs through the city of Provo, but we've been asked to not name that river on this podcast. But it is the lower section of the river that runs through the city of Provo. It gets hammered by anglers, just absolutely smacked. And it's it's a place where you will. Well, I got to be careful how I say this here. It's a place where you can definitely experience shoulder to shoulder fishing. I've never. Okay, take that back. I've had a lot fewer bad river etiquette experiences on the lower Provo than other anglers I know. I guess I got kind of lucky. But that being said, we were all fishing together a lot closer than I would have preferred. So that's one of the caveats. Like I knew back when I lived in Utah, I was going to go to the lower Provo and fish. I knew I was more than likely going to be closer to people than I would prefer to be. That's just the nature of being out there on the river. That's one of those local customs. Now, I'm not saying that we were up on each other's holes. We're not fishing the same hole, but we are generally a little bit closer than what I would prefer. I like all the distance in the world. I like to not see anybody else, and you're just not going to get that on that kind of river. Now, I do want to share a quote on this point here as well from Pat Dorsey. Pat Dorsey wrote he wrote a really nice little blog post about fly fishing etiquette. I'm going to link that in the podcast description as well. But one of the quotes that specifically applies to this tip here, he says, quote, when conditions are crowded, be flexible as far as fishing is concerned. Only so many people can fit into certain areas. Everyone should have the opportunity to share the resource. Once again, communication is important. Move around so that everyone has an opportunity to sample the better holes. Again, I'll link that story from Pat in the podcast description because I think it's worth sharing. And we'll get more into into that move around idea here in a minute because that is really important. But really, just be aware, like he said, and be flexible. Right? Be aware, be flexible, move around a little bit. It's not the end of the world if you don't get to spend all day in your favorite little spot. And then communication is key, like he said as well. But again, the big thing is try your absolute best not to crowd each other. And I think you will find your experience on these crowded rivers a little bit better if you go out of your way to not crowd each other. Give you an example here. Last year, me and Alex were out filming for our masterclass and some upcoming projects that we've got. And I think we had to change our filming plans almost every single day based on how crowded the rivers were because we didn't want to impede on somebody else's fishing, especially since we were filming and fishing. It's a little bit different than just fishing. We didn't really want to ruin somebody else's day, so we changed spots frequently. And then I do remember there was this one time where we were clearly filming. Alex, I'm in front. I think we were both in front of the camera. I think Berkeley was with us. Me, Berkeley, and Alex. Me and Alex are in front of the camera. We're clearly talking to the camera, doing this work, and this feller just comes on over to us and yells, "Hey, how's the fishing?" Right in the middle of us trying to get this take done. And it was one of those moments where I just looked at him and I thought, are you that unaware that you're asking people who are clearly in the middle of doing something? You know, it's one thing if we were just fishing, but we weren't. We were standing talking in front of the camera. Anyways, point is, me and Alex changed our filming locations a lot, and we went to places that were a lot harder to get to film because we wanted to make sure we weren't crowding other people out. And I do that all the time. I probably give people more room than I maybe need to on some of these rivers, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. So again, make sure that you're giving each other enough room and you'll be in good business. Now, tip number 2, be aware of where you are at in relation to other anglers. This, I think, is the toughest thing to wrangle with on a crowded river But before we get into that, I'm going to pull another quote from that Pat Dorsey article because he really hits the nail on the head here with what you should look for. He says that when you're moving from one spot to another spot on the river, never enter the water or stand on a high bank on the opposing side of the stream. This is especially frustrating when you are trying to stalk a rising fish. If you have any questions, approach them from behind and downstream. It's okay to let someone know in a friendly tone of voice that you are working a fish and see if they would walk around you. If I see an angler working a pot of rising fish, I swing away from the bank at least 20 feet so that I don't spook any of the rising fish. This type of behavior goes a long way, trust me. And again, that's from Pat Dorsey. Now, I think this is one of the toughest things to do on a crowded river to like make sure you know where you're at in relation to other anglers simply because there might not be enough room on the banks to get around other anglers without getting in their way. But with that aside, I really love what Pat said about looking at what the other anglers are doing. When you are making a move or you are looking for a new spot to fish, pay attention to what the other anglers are doing. Don't just get your stuff and get out of your spot. Take a minute to look around to see what else everybody else is doing. If they're fishing to risers, you're going to want to give them a wider berth than if they're nymphing part of a seam. And the reason you want to do that is how you move within the river can impact the fishing for all of the people around you. So it pays to be acutely aware of that, especially in crowded fisheries. And I really just can't stress enough how important it is to just communicate to somebody. I've never once been upset or frustrated when somebody comes up to me and asked if, hey, are you fishing that spot? And if they don't mind if they go up ahead of me a little bit. In fact, I prefer it. I get really, probably irrationally upset, kind of like there was this one time I went and ordered wings, and I ordered bone-in wings because if you're going to have wings, you're going to get wings, not chicken nuggets, all right? That stuff they serve at Buffalo Wild Wings is not a wing. It's a chicken nugget with wing sauce, and the breading ruins the flavor of the sauce anyways. Anyways, I get irrationally angry like that. If I ordered bone-in wings and they served me boneless wings, all right, and I got pretty upset. Now I didn't make a scene because it's not the server's fault. At least I don't think it was, and it's not worth making a big deal about. But I was really angry, and I get that same level of anger when somebody just blitzes upstream and sets up shop pretty close to me without talking to me, without saying, "Hey, are you fishing this?" or "Have you fished this already?" Communication goes a long way, and unfortunately, we suck at it. I think as a general rule, as a general population, most people aren't good at communication. That's why if you have good communication skills, you're going to go places in this world because so many people lack them. Well, do your best. Talk to people out on the river. It can be intimidating, especially for a new angler. I understand that. I know how scary that can be when you're a newbie and you go to ask, especially one of the people who looks like they know what they're doing, like, hey, can I fish there? You might be scared out of your boots. Don't be. Because 99% of the time, they're going to be like, oh, yeah, I just fished up through that. Or they might say, hey, I was planning on going up this way. Go up above me, but if you could give me plenty of room so I can fish that next run, that'd be great. There's going to be that one time out of 100 that you just run into that douchebag and they're just going to be, oh, don't talk to me. I got my tweed and my bamboo. And they're going to be all grumpy about it. And, those people can go pound sand. Those people can go eat the boneless wings at B-Dub. This is what those people can do, all right? You can rest assured knowing you did the right thing. Now, I think I'm trying to make sure I hit everything on that tip that I wanted to get to, but again, I can't stress it enough. Be aware of where you're at in relation to other anglers. Be willing to communicate. That's going to go a long way, especially on these rivers that are really crowded. I remember, what was it, 2 summers ago now? Yeah, it was 2 summers ago now. Me and Alex in Berkeley were on the Henry's Fork, and we don't talk about this very much. But we were on the Henry's Fork, and I don't know if this is Henry's Fork custom or what, but we had 3 guys walk literally 20 feet downstream from us, so well within, like, where we were fishing. They walked 20 feet downstream where we're at, go out in the middle of the river and then start walking up right through where we were casting. Didn't say anything, didn't look at us. They knew they were probably not doing the right thing, ethically speaking, and etiquette is speaking from an etiquette point of view. But it was really frustrating. And if they'd just communicated like, "Hey, we want to get upstream from you guys," would have been a completely different ball game. But they didn't, and it really soured. Honestly, it soured all of us, not just on that day of fishing, but on the Henrys in general. So communication is going to go a long ways. Now, your last tip to make sure that you've got good river etiquette on these crowded fisheries. Tip number 3, don't set up camp in one hole. Move around. Now, I brought this up in our other episode about river etiquette, but it has even more importance here. If a river is really popular, there's a very good chance that it has some famous holes. I remember the first time that I ever fished the frying pan out in Colorado, and I wanted to fish the toilet bowl. And if you've ever heard of the frying pan or been there, you know what the toilet bowl hole is. But it was so crowded and nobody moved all day. Literally, the same anglers that were there in the morning when I got there were there when I left that evening, that I never got the chance to fish it the first time I went there. And it was pretty upsetting. Good river etiquette dictates that you be willing to move around and share the wealth, like Pat Dorsey mentioned earlier in one of those quotes that I pulled from him. Don't set up camp in one hole. If you get a great little spot, fish it well, fish it thoroughly, and then move along so somebody else can enjoy it. Like, you wouldn't keep your favorite pizza joint all to yourself, would you? No, you're going to go there. You're going to order the triple bypass with jalapenos. Then you're going to tell everybody else in the world, hey, go to Fat Jack's in Payson, get the triple bypass with jalapenos. They're going to come in. They're going to get it. It's not going to affect you because you already had it. All right. It's that same line of thought. And it's interesting to me that people will set up shop in one spot all day and just try to fish it. Like, I get it. There might be a big fish there, but that's just boring. Move around the river a little bit. Take a risk, take a chance, explore, find something new. It's not going to kill you. All right. And especially on these pressured rivers, we really do need to be willing to share it. That's a sacrifice we all have to make so that we can enjoy this resource. I mean, I even see this play out here in Wyoming on less pressured rivers. A while ago, I was out floating a local river, and there were like 3 other boats out. And the boat in front of us, he ran through a run twice, and then he moved on so that we could fish it. And we all boated fish from that run. It was great. So we all got to fish that run. We all got to put fish in the boat from it. And that was on a non-crowded day, too. I would have been fine if he just set up shop there all day, but he saw that we were upriver. And we weren't like trying to crowd him out or anything. We weren't sitting there. We were just working our way down. He ran through it twice, and then he booked it, and we got to go through it. We got our opportunity to fish it. It's the little things like that that are really going to go a long ways to making the rivers a more amiable place to be. Now, it is time to give some tips on how to fish these heavily pressured rivers, just like I talked about. So there's your river etiquette. Now let's talk about some ways to be a little bit more successful on those. Now, tip number 1, tweak the time that you go out fishing. I used to fish the Green River all the time down there in Utah. Back when I lived in Utah, I'd fish with my buddy Ryan Kelly, and we'd launch at like 5 or 6 in the morning and float. And those floats were cold, and I don't like getting up at 4:30 to get to the boat ramp, but we had some incredible fishing, and we had the river to ourselves. And these were like June, July, August, like the 3 busiest months of the year on the river, and we were there with it almost all to ourselves. It was wonderful because we were willing to get up and go early. And we also did some late floats. We'd put on at like 3:30, 4 in the afternoon and float till dark. And granted, you got to know what you're doing if you're going to float a river in the dark. I'm not advocating that you do that. Ryan's floated that river literally 10,000 times, so he knows the river a little well. But if you're willing to tweak the time you fish a little bit, you're going to be able to get out there and have a little bit more room to yourself so you don't have to worry about stepping on toes, so to speak. And the last tip that I'll give you for how to fish these pressured rivers is fish the water that a lot of other folks are ignoring. I'm going to go back to the Green River again. There's this big rapid, and on the edges of this rapid, there's these big, deep pockets, and fish hang out in these pockets, especially when there's a lot of dry fly action going. They'll get into these pockets and they'll just snack all day long. Great places to fish. I've caught some amazing fish from those pockets before because once we ran through the rapid, we'd park the boat and we'd walk back up the river and we'd fish those from shore. And it was an example of us being willing to think outside the box a little bit. We went to the waters that the fish get pushed to because there is so much pressure. They'll sometimes end up in the less than obvious water. And just to drive this home, I want to pull a quote from the folks over at Linehan. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I don't know if it's Linehan or Linehan Outfitting. They wrote a blog post and it says, quote, "Think outside the box, make a point to fish in less obvious holding water and feeding habitat. With more traffic, fish will get pushed around and seek safety and comfort in different places. On highly pressured waters, I've found fish holding in what would normally be considered less than perfect habitat. To this end, think both deeper and skinnier water, runs with uniform depth between riffles and pools, and any water between the best looking places on the stretch you're fishing." And I'll link that full post in the podcast description for y'all so you can find some information there. But hopefully that stuff was helpful and you enjoyed a little bit of a refresher on river etiquette and a couple of tips on how to fish these crowded rivers. Now it's time to grab your Diet Coke, grab your favorite snack of choice, kick back, because it is time for the Q&A portion of this week's show. Coleman from Indiana is going to start us off this week, and just a reminder to anybody, if you have a question for the show that you would like to get answered about fly fishing, about wings, about the superiority of Diet Coke over Coke Zero, please send those on in. There's always a link in the podcast description to submit those questions, so don't ever be afraid to write on in. We love to hear from you, and your questions really are what keeps this show going. I mean, I build each show around questions. So I'm not just sitting here like, oh, what am I going to talk about this week? It's, all right, what do people want to know about? Is that's the whole reason Ventures is here, right? To help you become a better angler. So anyways, send us questions if you got them. But Coleman from Indiana sent us one, and he writes in and says, when the water comes up and gets murky, are there best practices for colors for your streamers? This is a good question, Coleman. Appreciate you sending that in. A big thing to remember is that trout see extremely well, even in murky water. They see a lot better than we expect them to. There's not really a best practice for murky water other than to err on the side of high contrast. There's been a couple of studies done, scientific studies done, and a lot of what is assumed triggers a strike from fish, whether it's trout or bass, aside from the predation. A lot of what helps them see is not specific a certain color, but the contrast in color. Now, that comes with a caveat. Sometimes they really do love another color because it closely resembles a bait fish or something in their river. But the contrasting colors can really get their attention, especially in murky water. So, like a white and black streamer would be a great thing to use. I just keep fishing the same streamers you are already, though, following that age-old adage of bright days, bright flies, and dark days, dark flies. I know that seems counterintuitive, but it's a really good rule of thumb to stick with, and it's a rule of thumb I use in my own streamer fishing as well. Jeff from California writes in and says, "Hey, Spencer, I actually have several questions that I'm hoping to get your expert opinions on. I'm trying to get back into fly fishing after a 20-year hiatus. Grew up a spin bait guy and love the challenges of fishing in general. I would like your input on the following: tippet rings/swivels for fly fishing, mono rigs and their why, mix and match rod line weights, any benefits. Example would be the do-it-all 9-foot 5 weight with, say, 3-weight line to improve presentation and reduce drag. Thanks for all of your podcast work and sharing of knowledge with your team's video series. Thanks in advance. Well, Jeff, thank you, but be careful who you are calling an expert. All right. I don't ever pretend to be an expert. I'm just a feller who happens to fly fish a lot and can chat about it on the internet, I guess. Anyways, you brought up the mono rig specifically, and I'm not going to speak to that a ton, really, because I've never done enough with it to feel like I can speak authoritatively on it, and B, that's really Dominic Swintoski's thing over at Trout Bitten. So I'd much rather have Dom explain it to you than me to try and stumble through explaining what the mono rig is. So I'll link over to his post about the mono rig in the podcast description, so you can take a look at those. But I will get into tippet rings and the rest of your questions here. Tippet rings are great. They're very popular for a lot of Euro nymphing anglers, but I am starting to see them pop up more and more for folks who indicator nymph as well. And for those who don't know, a tippet ring is literally what it sounds like. It's a really tiny ring. I think usually they're stainless steel that you tie onto your tippet, and then you can tie tag ends off of that tippet. And all a tippet ring does is it just provides a solid anchor point from which you can tie multiple tag ends of tippet. So instead of tying your nymphs in tandem, where you tie the tippet to the bend of the hook of the first fly and then another fly to the end of that tippet, you can tie two different lengths of tippet to the tippet ring to distribute your nymphs where you want them in the water column, and then you can go ahead and adjust your indicator to match that depth. Tippet rings are pretty helpful for things like the bounce rig as well. We've talked about that. And it can be quicker to switch out flies and adjust depth with the tippet ring as opposed to the tandem nymph rigs. The only downside to tippet rings is that, in my experience, they can tangle easier than the tandem nymph rigs, so I've shied away from it. They're also so stinking small, they're easy to lose in your bag and easy to drop into the water. So I don't personally use them. I don't think Alex uses tippet rings very much, if at all. In fact, I think I talked to him about this, and I don't think he had. So it's not something a whole lot of us here at the VFC crew use, but there's certainly a lot of folks out there who love them. So I'm not trying to tell you one way or the other. I'm just giving you my 2 cents. Now, your second question here is pretty interesting about putting like a 3-weight line on a 5-weight rod to get a better presentation or to reduce drag. Well, let me say this, and I can't stress it enough, and I'm not trying to be a jerk here. Putting a 3-weight line on a 5-weight rod will not ever, well, okay, I shouldn't say ever. It will not improve presentation or reduce drag. You improve presentation and reduce drag through good casting mechanics and positioning yourself in the correct spot. Part of presentation is your ability to put yourself in the right spot. And if you can't put yourself in the right spot, no amount of changing the line size is going to give you a better presentation. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, I think the reason you're asking this is, well, a 3-weight line has less mass, so it's going to land softer, so I'm going to get a better presentation that way, correct? Well, yes, maybe. It really kind of depends. I'll dive into that in a second, but if you underline a rod, so if you put a 3-weight line on a 5-weight rod, that's going to cause that fly rod to not bend as much under load, which in turn means that you have to work harder to make that rod cast the line. So you can fish it, but it won't be pleasant. So yeah, if you threw a 3-weight line on a 5-weight rod, that 3-weight line might hit the water a tiny bit softer than the 5-weight line. But when you factor in the extra force that you might have to generate to make that 5-weight rod really cast that 3-weight line, then it's going to be pretty negligible. It's probably going to be the same as just casting your 5-weight fly line to begin with. It would be a lot more effective to learn to be better with your 5-weight than to try and mix and match. Again, underlining a rod will not impact your ability to reduce drag or get a better presentation. Now, the only caveat I'm going to put here is if you're fishing like 10, maybe 15 feet, and you just want to flick a little bit of line out there, and you think 3-weight line might spook the fish a little bit less than your 5-weight line, yeah, you could certainly try that. And I don't think that would be, you're not going to see those negative impacts of underlining a fly rod. It's when you try to cast that 3-weight line on a 5-weight at like 40 feet that you're really going to have to work a lot harder. And in those cases where you're making short casts anyways, I'd really say lengthen your leader so that you're casting more leader than you are fly line. That might help you get that better presentation as well. Now, you certainly can overline fly rods. In fact, you can make the argument, honestly, that most of the modern weight forward fly lines are doing just that because they're so heavy. A lot of weight forward fly lines are like a half size heavy. But you have to remember, and this is the thing I want everybody to remember. These fly rods are designed to cast a certain line. And when you mess with that equation, you're going to mess with the rod's performance. You're going to struggle to cast longer distances if you overline or underline your rod. It's just the reality of it. I know enough rod designers, and even the quote unquote cheap rods, the beginner rods, the entry level rods, they're still designed to work well. They're not designed to make it hard. They're not designed to be crap. They use cheaper materials, so they may not be as light or as inherently accurate. And that's a whole other thing that we can get into. But they're still designed to work with a certain amount of mass. And when you mess with that, you mess with the rod's performance. So instead, focus on getting yourself in a good position to reduce drag and get a better presentation that way. Really, really good question, though. Thank you so much for sending that in. Nick from California writes in. It says, I'm looking to buy my first pair of waders and have no idea where to start or how to use them properly. Would love your advice. Keep up the great videos and podcasts. Thanks, P.S. Diet Coke rules. You're dang right it rules, Nick. Oh, well, I really hope that you listened to episode 57 of the show, our wader extravaganza. We sat down with the folks over at Squala Fishing to talk all about waders. So I'm pretty sure we've answered like 90% of your questions already in that episode. It's episode 57. I'll link that in the podcast description for you so you can go check that out as well. But I will give a piece of advice here based on what we talked about in that episode. And that is to buy the best waders that you can afford. And by best, I don't mean most expensive. I mean the best waders for you. Let me give you an example of what I mean. Squala makes their carbon waders. I think they're $550, and it is meant to be an ultralight, no frills option that's durable, hence the price of $550. It's convertible from a chest to a hip wader. It doesn't have a ton of pockets, and it's extremely light. It is not designed to be like a bomber, cold weather, steelhead chasing wader like their RS waders are. For me, the best wader, and I've fished in the Sims G4Zs, I've fished in the Squala RS waders, I've fished in the Orvis Pro waders, I think I've fished the new Grundens waders. I've used those, I've reviewed all of those. I think the only waders I haven't reviewed are Patagonia. So I've been in all the top of the line waders. I've been in all of them. I've used them. I've loved them, and I've had some things that I've not loved about them because that's how it goes with any product. The carbon for me is the best because it fits most of what I need waders for, and it's not the most expensive option out there. Now, $550, I'm not trying to pretend that that's not an expensive option. That's a serious chunk of change, right? You could find something like this that fits your budget, but what I'm trying to get at is the carbon is everything I need in a wader. I wet weight as much as I can because I really don't like wearing waders to begin with. So I want the lightest wader I can get. I don't really need a ton of pockets and tool docks and everything else. Some folks, though, they really want all those bells and whistles. They want a zipper. They want pockets. They want fleece-lined hand warmers, the whole 9 yards. Those are the people who, yeah, they're willing to pay up for the Sims G4Zs or the Squala RS or whatever wader it is that they really like. They're willing to put the money into it, and more power to them. They know what they want. It's the best wader for them. So instead of like, oh, go buy the best wader and have that mean spend the most money, I would suggest that you drill down to exactly what you need your waders to do for you and then go shopping from there. If you want a lightweight option that you'll really only wear during the shoulder seasons when it's too cold to wet wade, look for those offerings from different wader companies and set your budget accordingly. There are plenty of usable waders on the market in that $250 range, but remember you're going to get what you pay for, especially when it comes to soft goods like waders that will wear out. I mean, that's one thing I really do want to press home, especially to newer anglers. Waders wear out. You have to replace them or repair them eventually. That's just the nature of that product. They're never going to last forever. As much as we love them to, they're just not going to. I've already patched my Squala RS waders. I've had those for a year and a half now, maybe 2 years, I think. And I've patched those. And I've got an older pair of Sims G4s that has like 3 big patches of Aqua Seal on it. So, I've got waders I'm running that I've patched. Granted, I fish a lot, so I'm putting these things through quite a bit, but that's just the nature of these products. All right. Both those waders have over 100 fishing days on them that I just mentioned. They've been used hard. So just expect that going into it when you buy your waders. And I don't think you're going to be too disappointed. But thank you so much for that question. I really appreciate it. All right, the last question of the show comes to us. Andrew from Washington writes in. It says, what, in your opinion, is the best way to tie on a fly? I've been fly fishing on and off for the last 17-ish years as work schedule would allow, and used to use a simple fisherman's knot, but was advised last year by an old-timer to try using the perfection loop for more natural flow of the fly. And again, that was Andrew from Washington. Well, Andrew, that's a really good question. And first thing I'd like to direct you to is we have an entire masterclass episode dedicated to knots and rigs. So if anybody listening has questions about knots and rigs, I'm going to link that in the podcast description. Go check that out once you're done with this podcast. Now, as far as your question goes here, I've always used the clinch knot, with the exception of the Rapala knot, and I'm going to continue to call it the Rapala knot. Some anglers will call it the non-slip mono loop, but it's the same stinking knot that you use. It just creates a loop at the end that doesn't slip, that your flies can kind of slide around on. I use that on my streamers and my still water rigs. I was talking with Tom Rosenbauer a while ago about knots, and he suggested that I look into using the Davy knot. He's mentioned that that's done a lot of great things for him. I didn't take Tom's advice, I guess, because I'm an idiot. When Tom gives you advice, especially personally, you should probably take it, but I haven't because, again, I'm an idiot. But the Davy knot would be one I would look at. But the old timer probably suggested that perfection loop for the same reason that I use the Rapala knot. It's going to let the flies move and bounce a bit more freely, which can be really helpful in a still water rig. The clinch knot doesn't allow for as much movement, but that really doesn't matter in a river environment where fish don't have as much time to inspect their fly as they do in a lake. Even for my dry flies, I stick with the clinch knot because it's a low-profile knot that causes little, if any, drag. It's strong, and it gives me the presentation I need. I don't see a reason to vary from that at all. So that's our show this week. Thank you all so much for listening through. I appreciate it. Again, if you've ever got a question that you would like answered about fly fishing, please send it on in. There's always a link in the podcast description. And the Pony Express is still going, even in the negative 30-degree weather we've had here in Wyoming. So you can send those on in. I can't guarantee the carrier pigeons are going to make it, though. It might be too cold for them. So don't send them here. I don't want to be responsible for the death of those beautiful little birds. All right? So y'all go out there. Have a wonderful rest of your week. And until next time, tie lines, everybody.